to Professor Manning for the invitation and for all of you for participating in the book club discussion of Speaking Yiddish to Chickens. This is the first time I've talked to a group that's read the book so closely, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and questions. I'll start off with a bit of an overview of how I came to write this book and touch on some of the major themes I explore in the book. This book began more than 25 years ago here on Long Island. I happen to be visiting my mom in my childhood home on Long Island right now. And it was here while home studying for law school finals in December 1998. I started visiting my grandmother each afternoon and over lunch asked her about her life. And we talked about growing up in Lublin, Poland, surviving the war, hiding in an underground dugout with my grandfather, and then coming to the US as refugees. In the years that followed, I visited Lublin and Belzec, the extermination camp where my grandparents' families were murdered, and Bensheim, the town in Germany where they lived for a time as displaced persons. But the part of their story that came to fascinate me the most was how my grandparents and roughly 1,000 other survivors, and I assume some in the audience are the descendants of those survivors, came to settle as poultry farmers in South Jersey. This is a personal story for me, and I explore in my book how my family and my grandparents' my grandmother's closest childhood friend wound up sharing a single farmhouse for many years and raising their daughters essentially as twins. But it's also a broader story about how Jews came to be farmers in the United States and why survivors came to settle in this unique community halfway between Atlantic City and Philadelphia. In terms of the story of American Jewish agriculture, most Jewish immigrants in this country gravitated to big cities. But smaller numbers settled in rural America, whether that was Appalachia, Gold Rush, California, or the Mississippi Delta, where they tended to start out as peddlers and then open small dry goods stores. A few had tried farming, often with the help of the Jewish Agricultural Society, which was funded by a philanthropist named Baron Morris de Hirsch. The first big wave of Jewish farming came in the 1880s when idealistic Russian Jews established communal farming colonies throughout the US. Most of these colonies failed quickly due to bad weather, the farmers' inexperience, or malaria. The few that survived were in South Jersey, in places like Alliance, that many of you may have heard of, where they were close to big markets in New York and Philadelphia. In the early 20th century, the Jewish Agricultural Society had given up on colonies and focused on settling Jews on individual family farms. By the 1930s, Jews were farming in all 48 then existing states. They were mostly concentrated in the northeastern US, from the Berkshires in Massachusetts down through Connecticut and the Catskills in New York, into New Jersey, mainly central New Jersey communities like Lakewood, Farmingdale, Toms River. And the form of farming that tended to work out the best was chicken farming. It required less capital, it was less physically demanding, and it required less land. And when the first Jewish refugees to make it out of Germany and Austria arrived during the Depression in the late 1930s, the Jewish Agricultural Society saw poultry farming as a great solution, and they looked to South Jersey as an ideal place to direct these refugees because farms there tended to be cheaper than in central Jersey or elsewhere where there were pre-existing Jewish farm communities. So there was this influx of refugee farmers in and around Vineland, which was at the time a community of roughly 30,000 people, and one that was unique in many respects. It was a place where glass and clothing factories mingled with farms. There were many Jewish-owned businesses, like in small towns elsewhere in the country. And here, the descendants of the original Italian immigrants who tended to grow fruits and vegetables coexisted with Jewish farmers who mostly raised chickens. The displaced persons, or Grinna, as they were known, which was a play on the term greenhorn for newcomer, they had lost their families and come to the US without much money. They knew little English. And they were attracted to farming by the promise of being their own boss and by the fact that I allude to in the title of the book that chickens didn't care if you spoke Yiddish to them. It was a joke that came up so often. I was struck in oral histories that survivors did about, hey, we spoke Yiddish to the chickens, they didn't care. And that's what planted the idea in my mind of ultimately using that as the book title. Survivors dissatisfied with life in New York or whichever other big city they'd initially landed in usually heard about poultry farming by word of mouth, whether it was a distant relative or a landsman from their hometown back in Europe or someone they met after the war in a displaced persons camp. Many newcomers who'd never farmed before and had little idea of what it involved expected farming would be easy. You don't do nothing, just collect the money, one survivor remembered hearing in Detroit before moving to Vineland, as if chickens laid $10 bills instead of eggs. As I'll discuss, and you probably are aware if you read the book, the reality of farm life was much different. At first, timing really worked out in the survivors' favor. These new arrivals, who suffered so much during World War II, benefited from the start of the Korean War, which drove up demand for eggs, and egg prices reached all-time highs in 1951. In this era, poultry farming was king in Vineland. The high school dubbed its football team the Poultry Clan. The city had billboards boast of it being the home of Vineland eggs, and Vineland even hosted a poultry festival that boasted the world's largest frying pan. There were hundreds of local poultry farms, including 500 purchased by Holocaust survivors alone. There were 17 poultry feed mills and 25 hatcheries and poultry dealers operating the area. So it was this economy that was much more than just the farms. It was all of the businesses that supported the farms, that vaccinated the chickens. It was a major industry at the time, not just in South Jersey, but really the state as a whole. New Jersey in the 40s and 50s was a poultry and egg powerhouse, the fifth ranking state in terms of egg production. Poultry was the top agricultural enterprise in the state at the time, and 4 New Jersey counties ranked in the top 10 in the entire nation in terms of chicken population, including Monmouth and Ocean counties. At the time, the typical poultry farm in the Vineland area was roughly 10 acres. They would have about 3,000 to 4,000 chickens. Most of these farms were raising them for egg selling, but a few raised chickens to sell for meat. And as in one talk I gave, people raised their hands and pointed out, yeah, but some people had turkeys. So I feel I have to mention some people also had turkeys. Even in the best of times, this was dirty, difficult work. You had to wake up early in the morning to make sure the chickens' water hadn't frozen. You couldn't take a day off because the chickens needed to eat 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Viruses would wipe out whole flocks. Wild dogs would snatch them in the night. The hens were nasty when cooped up together and could peck each other to death or smother each other in a panic during air raid drills, which were common in the Cold War era of the 1950s. The stench of the waste, the chicken waste, could be overpowering, and the brooder stoves used to keep the baby chicks warm at night could catch fire and burn down the coops. Finding reliable laborers was a challenge, and the relationship, as I explore in the book, between small farm owners and their workers were often fraught. Most of the newcomers who arrived during this period had never farmed before and had no idea what they were doing. Many had grown up in big cities and found it isolating to live on farms. Others who had moved to New York from crowded New York apartments found comfort in having so much land to themselves, even if it meant sharing their land with a few thousand hens. Their embarrassing missteps became the butt of jokes among veteran poultry farmers and local veterinarians, like the farmer who washed his eggs in water so warm that they hard-boiled inside, or another who told to give his chickens a teaspoon of vaccine, substituted an old family heirloom, and wound up poisoning his whole flock. These are the kind of mistakes you only made once. Many newcomers, they'd hoped for a stable, quiet life. They recoiled at all the uncertainty. Some dropped out of the poultry business as soon as they arrived. I write about one survivor refugee who only lasted 9 weeks before giving up chickens and switching to making upholsteries at the local Sears department store. But many more of these farmers stuck it out, as one farm wife later recalled. You'd be surprised how fast you could learn if you're in a jam. You had to make a living and take care of the children, and you just did it. We were fast learners. We had to be. Part of what eased the transition was the uniquely large Jewish presence in Vineland. I'd mentioned earlier how Jews had settled throughout rural America, but by the 1950s, most of these rural Jewish communities had started shrinking as Jews, like everyone else in rural America, started moving on to cities and suburbs. But in Vineland, the descendants of the original farm colony settlers and the German refugees who followed built a remarkably robust Jewish community full of synagogues, kosher bakeries, butcher shops, and delis. Vineland even had a half-hour local radio show every Sunday morning called The Voice of Israel that featured songs and programming in a combination of Yiddish, Hebrew, and English. The survivors would enrich this Jewish community and make it their own. They built shtibels, or small shuls, often with their own hands, within walking distance of their farms. They created the Jewish Poultry Farmers Association, a Landsmannschaft, or combination mutual aid society and social club, like the ones earlier generations of immigrants established in big cities. Their Farband, Yiddish for association, as they called it, hosted dinner dances and stars of the Yiddish stage. These comedians, poets, and journalists, most of whom were themselves displaced persons who traveled to wherever the scattered remnants of European Jewry had settled. They would perform to standing room only crowds at Vineland's high school and middle school, which were the only venues large enough to hold a sold out crowd of hundreds of people. And the survivors also commemorated what would later become known as the Holocaust. I can talk more at length perhaps in the discussion about the dynamics, the often tricky dynamics between the survivors and the earlier waves of Jewish settlers there. The survivors tended to keep to themselves at first. They later remembered feeling unwelcome by the existing Jewish community. And again, we can talk about whether that was their own insecurity, the insecurity of Jewish Americans who didn't quite feel secure in their place in America yet, or just the sort of comfort that survivors, like the German refugees before them, felt in praying amongst themselves and socializing amongst themselves. These distinctions tended to break down over time, with the children of survivors and German Jewish refugees joking later about intermarriage with the American-born Jews decades later. One other element I wanted to touch upon briefly is the children's experience, and how many of the survivor farmers had warm memories of their time there, while others hated every minute, which was in many instances such a fall from their status back in Europe. But in general, their children did tend to enjoy their time and their farm life, which could be both idyllic and dangerous. My mother's earliest memories, including petting soft baby chicks and the sight of the rifle her father kept handy to kill predators trying to snatch chickens. And they had ample opportunity to explore their physical surroundings, these children, because they were in a great deal of freedom to do so. The labor-intensive work of running a farm meant the parents didn't have the time to watch over their children closely throughout the day, all the more so during the summer when school was out. Nearly everyone recalled days on a patch of sand along the Morris River where the children played, teenagers danced at the jukebox, and their parents played cards while gossiping in Yiddish. On the one hand, the survivors' children lived a very cloistered life, full of Jewish Poultry Farmers Association, Hanukkah and Purim parties, socializing with other farm families in Yiddish and Polish. But the Grinna also felt pressure to keep up with their neighbors and provide whatever they imagined a proper American childhood required. And this is the same sort of assimilation pressure or sense of wanting to fit in as any other immigrant feels in this country, and also wanting to keep one foot in your existing identity. And we could talk more about that. So these survivors made sure to sign up their kids for Little League and Girl Scouts or Boy Scouts. Some families avoided the dissonance by enrolling their children in a private Jewish day school that opened in the fall of 1953 in a former farmhouse. And I try to give the image of that, how unique in Vineland that the site of a Jewish day school could share the same stretch of a rural road as Jewish chicken farms, a shtibel, the grounds of a rodeo horse show, and a nearby car racing track. So some of these families who would walk home from services on a Friday night, they wouldn't drive to services, so they built a little shtibel, a little small shul near their farms. They'd walk home, and in the distance, they heard cars racing on a racetrack. So it was just a very unique moment in time. And I try to capture that because this is essentially all gone. The Jewish Agricultural Society and the survivors didn't know it at the time, but the refugees had entered poultry farming at the worst possible moment. Small family farms couldn't compete with mega farms in the South that had much lower costs, including labor costs, and could support 50,000, 100,000, and ultimately a million chickens. Compounding that, in October 1954, Hurricane Hazel barreled through Vineland, peeling roofs off of coops like the lids off of tin cans, killing or leaving homeless tens of thousands of birds. Given the hard times ahead, excuse me, the lucky ones might have been the farmers who lost everything and used insurance proceeds to start over in a new business or in an entirely different place. Farm families looked for other ways to supplement their income as egg prices dropped throughout the 1950s. Many farm wives, including my grandmother, found work at Vineland garment factories. As the 60s progressed, all of the farmers found it increasingly hard to make a living, and many began abandoning their farms or South Jersey to find better work elsewhere. And in the decade that followed, nearly every farm ceased operating, and the Jewish community in Vineland began to shrink, just as similar rural communities had already contracted almost everywhere else in America. And by the time I visited Vineland the first time in 2004, which is 20 years ago now, on my first research trip there were few relics left of the city's poultry past. And if you were to visit there now, you would see some abandoned coops on properties, but few chickens. There are some people who might have a couple of chickens, but nothing on the scale of large poultry farming. So maybe we'll stop there and we could open it up to questions and discussion.
Yeah, so if you can either raise your actual hand, but then I need your camera on, please. Or if you want to just raise your digital hand, that would be great also. Stephen and Jody will be monitoring the chat if you want to pop a question in there, and I'll take care of calling people this way. But first, Seth, thank you so much for that really wonderful talk. I have lots of comments and questions, but I will do my best to sort of restrain myself and let others go. So I think, Marion, are you raising a hand? Go right ahead. Wait, you're muted. I might be able to unmute you.
Okay, how's that?
Good. Perfect.
All right. I really wanted to meet Seth in person today, but I'm in Southern Delaware now. I grew up in Vineland. I am one of those who was born on a chicken farm. And it was only just recently, my background isn't Polish exactly. But I just found out recently that my family had a unique experience. They were on the German side when they came. So, and I just found out, I loved Seth's book because I knew a lot of people. I grew up with the kids of some of the people that your mom grew up with. But anyway, I just found out that it was the Italians that helped some of the Jewish immigrants start their farm. And in fact, I am one of those. I thought my farm was my grandparents'. It was not. They were missing in Shanghai. And it was my uncle who got money from a Gardella in Vineland to start his farm. And then he got another farm and asked my father if he wanted to come and continue that farm. So that's how I ended up on it. But I have a lot of memories of that farm. And so I just wanted, I have more though of the people that came from the German side. You have
Sure.
the Polish side.
Yep.
But I have some very unique uh, stories with that one too. So I just
Well,
wanted to say that.
well,
And
yeah.
and by the way, do you know who started the first continuous chicken coop?
Who's that?
His last name was Motter. I'm sorry, Chapman.
Oh,
Chapman. I can't think of his first name, but I am friends with his daughter. And I have the newspaper article. I have tons of Holocaust
mhm.
information, but he started the first continuous chicken coop. So I thought I'd like to know that.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And you mentioned the help that people received from Italian families in Vineland, and I recount some of that in the book. I mean, at the time, Vineland was very much an Italian town. The mayors were Italian. A lot of the professionals were Italian, and they were also involved in truck farming, the fruits and vegetables, some chickens. But they were often very generous I recount one story in the book. An Italian farmer would take a farmer and his wife to get their meat butchered in a kosher manner, or to say a memorial prayer at a local synagogue. The same Italian farmer took another family I spoke with to a hospital in Philadelphia because their child needed medical care there. So yeah, there are many stories of great generosity. So it's a nice element of the story.
And I also want to comment when you said the immigrant Jewish children did feel different because we were on one side of the tracks on the boulevard. The American-born ones that I grew up with, we didn't really meet them till later on in high school. And they were, they weren't real gracious to us, but we as immigrant children, children of survivors, we really had a good friendship.
Mhm.
But I related to everything you said in the book, I related to. So just so you know that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Jay Chaskis, it's really good to see you. You're up.
It's so nice to see you and Jody. This brings back two memories for me. I'm an octogenarian, so I have memories of post-World War II. And my father worked for the Schechter brothers in Brooklyn, Brothers Kosher Poultry, which actually were famous. They were part of a major lawsuit that went to the Supreme Court, Schechter Brothers versus United States. And as a kid, I can remember my father he would get up at 2:30 in the morning to get in a truck and drive from Brooklyn to Lakewood, to Vineland, to Tom's River to get poultry, or occasionally up to the Catskills. And he would come back and he would tell me all these stories, and he was a fluent Yiddish speaker. So, that's one of the reasons why the Schechter brothers sent him to South Jersey to do this. And this brings back just tremendous memories for me. And the other thing I want to mention has to do with Rowan University. When we started our first board of trustees, the president of the board of trustees was named Tevis Goldhaft. I don't know if that means anything to you. So you know that the Goldhaft family were among those agricultural settlers that started that from the Baron de Hirsch Fund. And the father was a chicken farmer, and then Tevis's father became a veterinarian and developed vaccines to vaccinate chickens. And then Tevis took over in his father's place, and they became a fairly affluent family in South Jersey.
Yeah, the Goldhaft family and their Vineland Poultry Laboratories was the most successful business related to the chicken business in Vineland. They sold their vaccines around the world. Chickens got sick easily, and the vaccinations helped protect the flocks and make it a more viable business. And they were the sort of most famous Jewish citizens of Vineland. I recount in the book Arthur Goldhaft's memoir was a bit controversial within the survivor community. The Golden Egg was the name of the book, and the way he characterized survivors. I talk about that in the book as a sort of one of the instances of tensions and how things played out. But that business got sold a few times and no longer operates in the Vineland area.
On a personal note, I can tell you that Tevis Goldhaft was a real mensch.
Oh, everything I've read would suggest that. So thank you very much for your comments and for being here today.
Thank you for being here. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Jay. Good to see you. Seth, I have two questions really quick from the chat. One from Steve Goldberg, who was born and stayed in Vineland through high school. Steve's comment is the survivors never talked about their former lives. His generation left Vineland after high school, and he doesn't think any returned. So maybe talking about this silence and that issue, right? And also from Debbie Drachman, who's a friend of ours, does the Jewish Agricultural Society still exist?
Well, that's the easier question. I'll do that one first. Now, the Jewish Agricultural Society by the late 60s and early 70s ceased operating. What happened is there was this surge of refugees in the 40s into the 50s who wanted to become farmers, but it trailed off. As I said, the family farming wasn't particularly viable, and so there just wasn't any more newcomers. The De Hirsch philanthropy was underwriting it, and it just couldn't do so anymore. And so it ceased operating in, I think, about 1970, 72. That was the end of that. On the first point about the silence, I do address that in the book, I think, and this is one of the themes I hope comes through in the book, is that the survivors weren't a monolith. I think there's a tendency to think of them, and this is probably something you've discussed in prior iterations of the book club, but I think there's a tendency to think of them as whether they came here, they were broken people, and they remain broken people, or they were all a story in perseverance and survival and triumph of the spirit. But it was a range, and it was a range in terms of how they dealt with their trauma, how they did in terms of a livelihood in America, how well they did, how much their religious observance was meaningful for them going forward in this country, and in terms of how they spoke about the war. And there were people who did speak about their experiences, but many more, including my grandmother, didn't want to talk about it. There were so many survivors in Vineland that you could almost self-select in your social life. And if you wanted to have a poker game and talk about the war a lot, you could. And if you didn't, you would gravitate towards friends, fellow survivors who didn't want to talk about it. And my grandmother, for instance, and her best friend from childhood, who miraculously both survived, and they shared a farm for a number of years and raised their daughters, spoke nearly every day of their life into their 80s. They never talked about it, and my grandmother didn't really know much at all about what happened to her friend during the war, and that was typical. And some of the survivors were more comfortable talking to grandchildren, like myself, where my grandmother spoke far more with me than she did with my mother about the war, maybe because more time had elapsed, or there was a sense that time was running out, or they had so much concern that they were going to damage their own children by talking about it, and less so with their grandchildren. So I think that silence lifted as the decades went on to some extent.
I wasn't sure if there were any more chat questions. Are we
No,
good?
there was just a comment from Steve again, who said he knew of no farmers who claimed the chickens spoke back to them in Yiddish. So.
Okay, then over to Jimmy, who has a question for you, Seth.
So one of the questions that I kind of had, and I noticed in your book, you discussed a lot about how these Jewish farming communities would, kind of appear and disappear over time. With this specific community of survivors, did you notice that a lot of people that left, did they go to places after they left Vineland that had another concentrated population of survivors, or was it just kind of different and displaced?
I mean, that's a very good question. I think the Jewish agricultural community in Vineland existed from about 1880, when the colonies were first formed there in the outskirts, into the 1960s. So it had an 80, 90-year span. And as I said, there isn't anything of that left. So the survivors, some stayed in Vineland, some stayed elsewhere in South Jersey. There were instances of people opening motels, for instance, or hotels in Atlantic City. A lot gravitated to Cherry Hill, and that became a big center and there were a lot of survivors there. In my grandparents' case, they moved to Brooklyn, where there were many survivors. So New York had a pull. In the course of what's fascinating to me, in the course of talking about the book over the last year, I've visited virtually or in person Jewish communities throughout the country, and how the survivors and their children moved elsewhere. And so I think if you were going to generalize, I think, sure, Cherry Hill or New York and its suburbs would have been the places where you would most often find them. But you could find pockets of them anywhere in the country. They were looking for economic opportunity. There were instances they opened convenience stores in Washington, D.C. or Los Angeles, or became real estate developer in Toronto. So they spread out all over the place.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Emily first, and then Marion, I see you waving your hand back up, but I'll come to you right after Emily. All right, thank you.
Sorry, I'm having unstable internet. I was wondering, so one of the things that's been very powerful about your book here is exactly what we've seen here, in that all these people are coming back with all these personal stories. And I feel like this talks a lot about the power of local history. And I just wonder if this is an experience you've had a lot when you've shared this book. And if you want to talk a little bit about why you decided to tell this really small story as opposed to maybe a bigger story about chicken farming or something like that.
Yeah, it's something that strikes me time and time again, wherever I've talked, online, in person, St. Petersburg, Florida, or Houston, as I mentioned, how you have people with these connections who recount their own experiences growing up in South Jersey on a poultry farm, or it was their parents or grandparents. And so it's just wonderful to tap into that and have it resonate with the people. And that was such a fear of mine working on this book. And I should talk about after your broader question, but the fear I had was I didn't grow up there. I started work on this more than 2 decades after my mom and grandparents moved away. Would I capture it accurately? So I did have that fear. So I'm somewhat gratified that, except for the fact that I left out the turkeys and some minor little things like that people aren't saying, oh, you got it all wrong. So that is nice. But in terms of why this little story, I started working on this with the idea, excuse me, perhaps that I was going to write about my grandmother's story as a survivor. And I mean, the truth is there are a lot of books about survival stories. And they tend to, and there just weren't that many ways to survive. You survived hiding in a forest. You survived passing as a non-Jew. You survived a labor camp. You survived by making it into the Soviet Union and being a prisoner or a worker somewhere in Siberia or the southern USSR. So I felt like those stories had been told, not my particular family story, but those survivor stories. But this was a story that hadn't been told, I think, and that had been largely forgotten, or at least not very well known outside of South Jersey. So I thought it was a story worth telling, that it is a story of resilience, that these people who didn't know how to be farmers had to restart their lives. And this is how they did it, and this is where they did it, and this unique Jewish community that had existed and that they supplemented and built, and what a unique place it was for a relatively narrow period of time. But I wanted to capture that and give people a sense of what it was like at that moment. And so that was my goal in writing it.
Yeah, I think I just want to say that you were really successful at doing that, and that like the way that people have responded to it. And I remember reading it about a year ago with some of my friends here, and it was just so captivating and just enlightening about Vineland. I'm a historian, and if I have time, I would love to write a book about Vineland because it's just got such an amazing history of generation after generation reclaiming what that town is about. But
Yeah, and that's a piece of it, and I like the way you put it. I mean, how it was a place for Italian immigrants, and then it was a place of Jewish immigrants, and more recently, it's become a place of Latino immigrants and Puerto Rican migrants, and so it is a wonderful story of different kinds of immigrants making it their own time and time again.
yeah, it was a utopia at one point. There's just like so many different things have happened there. I loved having another addition to the Vineland story.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Marion, did you still want to jump back in? Oh, wait, you're muted again.
I wanted to comment now on something that Seth said. Of course, I can't now remember. My senior moments are turning into hours. Something he commented, and I wanted to verify that he was right. Oh, I think I know. Growing up with all survivor, my friends were all survivor children. It depended on whether your parents told you what was going on or not. And my parents did not talk about it. So, however, I had several girlfriends I was very close with, and I thought their parents were odd because the mothers would cry all the time. When I was there, they got so close in your face when they talked, they referred to the Holocaust all the time. And I thought that was a little bit odd, but of course now, after many years, I understand what the difference is. So, and of course, now that I've been exposed to something about the FKBP5 gene that they have been studying on survivors, and it's now into the second and third and fourth generation. I can see where the Holocaust has passed on the effect of trauma to its children and grandchildren. So
Yeah, I mean,
it's everything Seth said.
I'm not a psychiatrist, psychologist, any of the above to get into the generational trauma question, but in terms of the variety of how survivors spoke about it, I recount in the book my mom, a very strong childhood memory, a fellow farmer just around the corner. It was my mom's closest childhood friend in the neighborhood. And she would go over there for a sleepover, and she remembered vividly the next morning the mother over the breakfast table recounting having her nails pulled out being tortured essentially by Germans during the war in a camp. So it's a memory that never left her 70 whatever years later. So people talked about, and my grandmother would never talk about a thing with her, kept the pictures of her family hidden in a cigar box rather than hung up on the wall. It was just too painful to even look at all of the photos of the people she lost. So just tremendous variation in how they coped.
Thank you. Any other questions before I jump in and ask some of mine? Yeah, Stephen.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. We were talking just a little bit before we opened the session, Seth, on about your book and the writing process, and I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, right? This 25-year journey. I mean, that's a long gestation period for writing, and I'd love to hear about kind of the ebb and flow of that, and particularly if there was a moment or moments that were particularly revelatory, that where you really thought, I've learned something really new, or I've started to think, very differently about, my own family and my own family's experiences, or what have you, or whether it was more of a sort of 25-year trajectory that led up to publication. I think it's such a terrific book, and I'd love to hear how it sort of came together in your mind.
Yeah, I mean, I want to be clear. It took 25 years, but I wasn't doing that full time. My career got in the way, and I was working on another book. But I was doing research on and off over that period of time, and some of it you could see the way resources have changed. I used to have to go to the Vineland Public Library. It was the only place you could get the Vineland, what was then the Vineland Times Journal, on microfilm to go through it. And so I would spend weekends there going through the microfilm, and teenagers would walk by and that's a crazy looking television. They'd never seen a microfilm. They had no idea what I was doing. But by the end, it was all available on newspapers.com, and you could do just search any word and it would pop up on your screen. So it became much more accessible. And that was true about a lot of the resources that I needed to write the book. So that's, I guess, one advantage. If you take long enough, things become more accessible. But I don't know if there was the moment I started writing this, it was November 2019. I said, okay, I think I have enough. Let's try to write something. And then the pandemic started, and stuck at home and provided a lot of writing opportunities. So it took about 2 years to write while also working full time. And I don't know if there were a single revelatory moment. There were a lot of moments throughout. And just one thing that struck me in the course of, I found reference in the archives of the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, refugee aid, reference to suicides among farmers. And so then I went back to the newspaper, the microfilm from that era, and I came across 3 or 4 or 5 suicides in the summer of 1954. Some of them were by newcomer refugee farmers. Some were by farmers who had lost their spouses. And that was a moment where it just brought home how difficult it was. People entered farming. These were people who came too late. They bought high. Their farms were expensive. Egg prices were slipping, and it just wasn't sustainable. They had big mortgages they couldn't pay off, and they committed suicide. So for me, that just showed how awful the situation was and the impact it had on these farmers.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah, Jody.
So I guess I just have another question going off Stephen's, right, about this book has been out for a year or so, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so after all of your talks, which have been plenty, right, what's going to be in the second edition, I guess, is the question, right? What's going to be in there? I just would like to know what else is going to happen. So what have you?
It's funny, no matter how long you work on something, you stop, and then you find you miss something. Or the holy grail for me was this newsletter, like a community newspaper, mimeograph, that a farmer had put out, one of the survivors, in Yiddish and English, and I was never able to get copies. And then after publication, the grandson of Mr. Kupperwasser, who did this newsletter, got in touch and had scanned copies of it all. And I don't think it would have transformed the book, but again, just another source of rich detail that I wish I could have had. So no matter how much work you do, there's always something else that comes up after you finish.
Thank you for that. And I just want to say, so personally, right, Miles Lerman is a major person in your work. And I had been through his archives at the U.S. Holocaust Museum, never ever knowing, right, his history. And so I thank you for that. That was just something that really, who knew, right?
Yeah, the parallel I draw in the book, my grandparents met them in Europe. The Lermans came over to the U.S. on the same boat. The Lermans followed them into farming in New Jersey because of the mutual friend. but their trajectories were just very different. The Miles Lerman was tremendously successful in the home heating oil and gas business and real estate, was a major fundraiser for the U.S. Holocaust Museum, and was the first president of the council that oversees it. So just a very public figure and a real success story in terms of survivors. And my grandparents never had that kind of material success. So you arrive in the country on the same day, but the trajectories are just different. Yeah.
Fascinating. Thank you.
I wonder if you could, Seth, what is the one thing or two things, right, that you want people who have read your book and sort of engaged in these discussions to walk away and either think about or ask on their own, and as they sort of move forward? What are in your mind, sort of the things that ideally we would all be taking away from this?
That's a good question. And I think one I mentioned is that they weren't monolithic, and I already touched on that. I think a second is people ask, well, was this a failure? I mean, the whole Jewish agricultural experiment in general, or the settling these survivors on farms? And what I think about that is that, even if the farms had been successful, would these survivor farmers had wanted their children to take over? Would there still be farms in South Jersey? And I think the answer is no. They had the same aspirations for their children as all other American Jews or middle class. They wanted them to go to college, become entrepreneurs, enter professions. And so I don't think either way you would have had, but it was a way station. It was a starting point in America. And in that way, it was successful. It was a different starting point than if they stayed back in New York or whatever other city they started in. But I don't think they were handicapped or their children were somehow at a disadvantage because they were on farms. They had a very different experience growing up, and in many ways a positive one, but I don't think it in any way hindered them and their children. One other point along those lines is the parallels. I've thought about this some since, just in reading other books of their experience and other refugees that have followed them. There are a lot of parallels, and the ones that preceded them, immigrants. You could look at, because while I was writing, it was so evident, the way that the survivor refugees were talked about in the time of the 1948 Displaced Persons Act and the 1950 Displaced Persons Act. And opponents in Congress talked about them as untrustworthy, and they were going to be subversives with communist sympathies, and they were dangerous if you let them into the country, is the same way that people talked about allowing Syrian immigrants into this country while I was writing this book. There was a real parallel that they were dangerous, they were subversive. So that's something that strikes me, is there is something consistent in the way we talk about refugees and the distrust we have. And if the survivors, we look back at them as sympathetic, there's reason to think about other refugees equally sympathetically.
Marion, are you jumping back in?
Yeah, Seth is so right, because I remember we had farm workers. They lived in a part of the coop. We got a little kitchen for them, and after the chicken farm went, I know one of them became a doctor. He was Hispanic. There was one, I guess he was someone of color. I don't know where he was from because I was too little. But again, he made his way, and you are so right. They developed into, they went on to school then, their children went to school, and they, their life became different. So I love your book.
Thank you.
Any last questions or comments before we wrap up?
I think you should write another book.
I think we'd all probably agree. And I guess, Seth, I would say when you write your next book, I feel we should be like top of your list for book talks.
Well, I will say that something that fascinates me, and I don't know if I'll be the one to write this book. You mentioned, Jenny, your own ties to the Lakewood or the Toms River area.
Mhm.
The trajectory of Lakewood, which was another Jewish farming community, and I talked about how the Jewish community has the downward trajectory there.
Mhm.
If you contrast that with what's the case in Lakewood, where the presence of the BMG yeshiva has been a magnet, and it's just an absolutely booming
Mhm.
Jewish community in Orthodox and its surrounding, and has spread out into Toms River and other neighboring communities. So I find that a fascinating story. To New Jersey, I keep being drawn to New Jersey stories. So that seems like a good one.
Maybe co-writing a book is in our future. Well, if there are no other questions, before I toss it back to Jody,
Jenny?
yes.
There is actually one.
Oh.
There is one other question in the chat, which I think is a really interesting one.
Sure.
It raises some really interesting questions. A question about or a comment saying I think it's from Steve Goldberg. In his experience, there wasn't actually kind of American patriotism sort of front and center within the Jewish community in Vineland. Among survivors and others, and he was wondering if you came across anything related to this. How can these various identities kind of be balanced, which I think is a really kind of intriguing idea, and wonder what you have to say about that.
You're saying that they did feel patriotic.
It says that did not.
Oh, did not?
Yeah, did not.
There again,
So,
I don't know if I could generalize, because I could just speak to my own grandfather, who felt just a tremendous sense of gratitude and loyalty to the United States, the country that had saved him and his family and taken them in. And no matter how much or how little success he had here, it was deeply, deeply patriotic and loved America. Whether that translated into flag waving and that sort of thing or not, he felt a deep appreciation and love for the country. I think if I was going to generalize, they did tend to stay out of politics. There was a distrust or fear about government. They didn't want to stick out. And so where you had in other farming communities like Farmingdale and Lakewood and Toms River, who earlier generations of Jewish farmers had some red or socialist sympathies, and that played out through the Cold War, tensions between Reds and others in these communities. That there was less of that in Vineland. The survivors came here, whatever pre-war enthusiasms they had, or that was all gone. They wanted to raise their family. They wanted to make a living. They had no interest in getting involved with those sort of movements beyond Israel and Zionism. They had that identification, but not a political or ideological bent.
Thank you. And before I turn it over to Jody to say a broad thank you, I will just say sort of personally, thank you. This was really great to get to meet you even virtually and to listen to you talk about your book, which I also loved. So thank you. And now I'll let Jody sort of wrap us up.
Okay, thank you, Jenny. Yeah, I mean, I just want to say wow, and thank you for being here, Seth. This is really an honor. We really have had a great semester so far, and I would also, I mean, if you're not doing anything on, Wednesday, the 17th of April, we will have our last meeting, which will be virtual and in person in Wilson 105. To where we will have our final sort of wrap-up discussion. So, and one of the big questions I just wanted to say that we always ask at Book Club is, how do we use this as educators, right? Whether we are professors or teachers. And so, I mean, it is clear from what we've even talked about today, how many themes, how important this book is, and the reception we have found, not only locally, but of all of our participants around the country. So, thank you so very much for doing this and for coming and talking with us. So,
well, thank you. I enjoyed speaking with you and hearing from you all, and really appreciate that you're taking the time to talk about this book.
Thank you, and enjoy your time with your spring break.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much, and thank you to all of those who joined us today. And hopefully, again, our last meeting for Book Club this semester, although we have many events coming up for the center, will be on April 17th from 12:30 to 1:30. Thank you so very much. Have a great day.